Hello listeners, and welcome to the NK News podcast, recorded here in Seoul on Friday, February 1st, 2019. And today I'm joined by Ms. Signe Poulsen, Seoul representative of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, or Ohchr. We will be talking about the international community and what it can do to improve human rights in North Korea. But before that, an announcement. Once again, NK News is offering a free year's subscription to one reviewer who reviews our podcast, not only at iTunes, but also at other platforms. And you can save $50 off your NK News subscription by using the code podcast at the checkout. Don't forget, if you like this podcast, please share it with others so that our listenership will continue to grow. All right, my guest today, Signe Poulsen, has served as the representative of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, it's a long title, or Ohchr, in Seoul since August 2015. Prior to this, she served in various capacities for the Ohchr, including postings in Liberia, East Timor, Kyrgyzstan, and Papua New Guinea. Before joining the United Nations, Ms. Poulsen worked with international human rights organizations, including Amnesty International. She's a Danish national and holds an MSc from the London School of Economics in Human Rights. Thank you for joining me and welcome, Signe.
Thank you.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'm guessing from the name that it's something that comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights signed just over 70 years ago in December 1948. Is that correct?
It is correct, but it's also correct that it even goes further back than that. So the UN Charter, when the UN was first created, recognizes that there are three pillars that the UN works towards. Peace and security is one, development is another, and human rights is a third one. And so what the leaders at that time came up with was that these three areas have to be progressed together so that in order to achieve them in a sustainable way. In the beginning, as a smaller office, and then over time, as the human rights framework developed, like the UDHR, and also the covenants and conventions later on, grew in importance and had its headquarters in Geneva.
And how long has the Ohchr had an office in South Korea?
So Ohchr opened its office in South Korea in 2015, and I arrived at that time.
So you were here to open it?
I was here to open the office.
Okay. And was your purpose, or was the purpose for opening an office here mainly to look at issues in North Korea?
It was only to look at issues in North Korea, in fact.
Okay.
It followed directly from a resolution that was passed in the Human Rights Council after the Commission of Inquiry report.
Right. Okay. And the reason that you're here in South Korea is because it's not possible for you to open an office in North Korea. Is that correct?
Indeed. In most situations, we would have a country office operating inside the country to do technical cooperation or monitoring or whatever the mandate is.
Right.
But
so when you were in Liberia, you were working on issues within Liberia.
Exactly.
And so on. Okay. So given that you're not actually there in North Korea, and it's, as we know, it's hard and almost impossible to communicate directly from South Korea to North Korea, is there a channel of communication for the Ohchr to communicate with the Dprk government?
Sure. As with other member states, the communication with Dprk goes via the permanent mission of the Dprk in Geneva and our headquarters in Geneva. So that line of communication works, and we can talk about what is also done with the Dprk in Geneva. From our office in particular, it's very difficult because the Dprk or North Korea doesn't recognize the resolution that establishes our office.
So then when you communicate to the permanent representation in Geneva, given that they don't recognize the resolution or the existence of your office, how does that work? Is communication one-sided, or how does it function?
Well, the Dprk, as a member of the United Nations, of course, recognizes the Ohchr as a whole. So communication on thematic areas like women, children, persons with disabilities, or technical cooperation more broadly works well, and there is two-way communication about that in Geneva.
So to what extent, then, is it possible to work on North Korean human rights issues while having no direct access and being based here in South Korea?
In terms of our work on North Korea, of course, not having access is a big disadvantage. It means that you're only getting a certain part of the information you would like to have. It means that there are people you would like to talk to that you're not actually able to talk to. So in other contexts, for example, if there was an allegation of a violation happening, you would go and talk to various people involved or allegedly involved and try to find out a full picture of what was happening. In North Korea, we have narratives of people who leave North Korea, but there's a lot of information we're missing. Having said that, that doesn't mean we can't work on human rights violations in North Korea from here. We have a lot of information. We have access to information that has been accumulated over time. So it is possible. But of course, there are also limitations.
That must feel very frustrating for you. It must be, I can only imagine for myself, it would be like working with one hand tied behind my back and wearing a blindfold. And sometimes you must wonder, am I achieving anything here?
I never wonder if I'm achieving anything. I do think we are achieving many things. And I think the Office for Human Rights has achieved a lot over the 5 years since the Commission of Inquiry published its report, but also in the longer term. Human rights is not something that can be resolved quickly in a country. So I think a certain measure of patience and taking one step at a time is something I would always strive to look to. You know, with the good cooperation we've had here in Seoul with civil society organizations and also, of course, with the assistance of the brave and dedicated North Korean people who have shared their lives and their stories with us. That's something that has made a great impression on me personally, but also that has helped and contributed to the overall work we are doing.
That's great. You certainly, you sound like a much more patient person than I would be in your situation. Now, we have, as you mentioned, a lot of, about 30,000 former North Koreans who live in South Korea. Do you have some people call them North Korean defectors, North Korean refugees, escapees. Do you have a term in the OHCHR that you use for these people?
It's something we've debated a lot. And I think one has to look at the individual and see what their motivations are and what their situation is. You know, the refugees is difficult because they have a certain status in South Korea that's different from refugees you would see in many other parts of the world. Escapees certainly is a term that we have used in the past, and defectors as well, although that can have connotations which are problematic in some cases at least.
Right. What are the key areas of human rights in North Korea that the OHCHR looks at and focuses on?
We look at the whole range of human rights. So in human rights, we have, of course, the economic and social rights of people, like the right to food and nutrition, to an education, to decent working conditions, those kinds of things. So we have economic and social rights, like the right to food, water and sanitation, the right to health and education. But we also have civil and political rights, like the right to freedom of expression, to association, to criticize the government in a peaceful way, and to leave one's country. So we work on a full range of rights in North Korea.
Some people, you mentioned the two different types of rights, the civil and political rights, and as opposed to, what was the first group again?
Economic and social rights.
Economic and social rights. And there are some people, some groups who would put them in almost two tiers and say that the economic and social rights are the ones that we should focus on now, make sure that North Koreans have enough to eat, that they have a roof over their heads, that they have an ability to keep warm in winter, and that the civil and political rights are something that can be postponed until, some unnamed future date, or maybe just ignored completely until North Korea is ready to deal with them. Do you accept this sort of bifurcation of rights?
I think there is a growing understanding that this division between those sets of rights is a slightly, or more than slightly, artificial one. What we say is that actually these rights are interdependent. If you don't have an education, for example, if you don't have the right to voice concern about things that are happening in your community, you don't have a channel to forward concerns to your government on lack of economic and social rights, like the right to food, or the fact that you don't have clean water, or the fact that there is a factory in your neighborhood that's polluting the environment. So this right to freedom of expression, the right to move, for example, to better your life, the right to upward social mobility, if depending on your talents and opportunities, those rights that create equality of opportunity in a way are so important for the fulfillment of economic and social rights that you cannot really separate the two. Likewise, of course, if you don't have enough to eat or drink, fulfilling your right to freedom of expression is very difficult. So it works both ways.
So we have to look at them both kind of in tandem, not putting one group before the other.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, since early last year, we've seen North Korea dramatically increase its diplomatic engagement with the outside world, including South Korea, China, and the United States. And of course, we're expecting at the end of this month, the end of February, a probable second summit between US President Donald Trump and North Korea's chairman Kim Jong-un. At this point, one criticism that has been made is that human rights issues really haven't been mentioned in these talks with neither with South Korea nor with China or even with the United States. What's the importance of including human rights into diplomatic talks with the Dprk?
It's very important to include human rights, and it's very important to do it from the outside. And I think one mistake that's sometimes made is that including human rights is necessarily a confrontational thing. I think there are ways where you can use human rights actually to build trust rather than to undermine it. And this includes things like cooperation on economic rights, social rights, rights of persons with disabilities, the separated families, which was a positive outcome we saw of the first summit. All of those things are measures that would build trust rather than undermine them. Then you have a set of very difficult and sensitive topics that North Korea would like not to discuss. And we need to get to those as well. And no one is suggesting those should be ignored. But to use human rights to build trust, I think at this stage is a very important measure that one can take. It's also difficult to see how a process of engagement can be sustainable without including the fundamental rights to improve the lives of people who are living inside North Korea. I mean, presumably this is one of the things we would all like to see as an outcome of this process, is that those who are the very most vulnerable, those who are in the poorest situation inside North Korea, can have some improvement in their lives. And this doesn't mean we ignore, I mean, of course, the security issue is also a very important one, but there's nothing in those talks that would exclude including human rights as well.
I'm thinking historically about the Helsinki, I don't know, is it the Helsinki model or the Helsinki dialogue? But that was something that the United States used when talking to the Soviet Union back in the 1980s as a way of including human rights in the discussion. Is that a good model for what we could be doing with North Korea?
Yes, to a certain extent, I think there are similarities and there are many differences, of course, and we are in a different time now as well. But certainly looking at lessons that can be drawn and looking at what's different and what's the same with that process could be one way of moving ahead. And
is that something that the OHCHR does? I mean, do you, for example, put forward proposals to various governments and say, look, this is how you could be talking to North Korea about human rights?
We do encourage governments to include human rights in their approaches to North Korea, and we will always do that because that's in a way part of our work. Now, how individual states decide to approach it, of course, is their prerogative. But we certainly also bring suggestions to the Dprk directly on how they could be approaching human rights, and that can be done, for example, through the treaty body reviews or through the UPR, where member states make recommendations, not us. So there are different forums in which recommendations can be made.
Do you think there's at some point that human rights should be used more forcefully to leverage some agreement or progress from North Korea before progress is allowed in other areas? For example, I'm thinking of before sanctions regimes against North Korea are completely lifted, that should human rights be used to sort of say, before you can have all the sanctions removed, we want to see this, and this?
I think it's important to see human rights and respect for human rights as a goal and not as a tool. And so the goal always have to be the improvement of lives of people living in North Korea, whether it's, in terms of their civil and political rights or their access to the basic needs of life. And so, there may be times when we choose not to engage with North Korea in areas where we may where such engagement may actually lead to human rights violations or may contribute to human rights violations within the country. On the other hand, humanitarian assistance, which exactly is improving those basic access to medical care and food and nutrition for lactating mothers and children, should never be subject to sanctions because they target directly those vulnerable populations within the country.
We have seen that a little bit, though, haven't we, in the last year or two, that exactly these areas, these humanitarian areas of NGOs working to bring things into North Korea to help people improve their conditions, that they have actually been either blocked or curtailed by sanctions.
Yes, and we talk about the unintended impacts of sanctions. So the sanctions in themselves do not prevent any humanitarian assistance, and the UN sanctions are very clear on that humanitarian assistance is not subject to these sanctions. But there have been indications at least that there have been some side effects. And that also includes things like donor countries being less interested in, for example, giving humanitarian assistance to North Korea because it's so difficult to oversee the distribution or what happens, even though I know that the UN agencies are doing very important and life-saving work in North Korea. So underfunding of agencies, for example, is a big issue for those working in North Korea.
Now, you mentioned the United Nations is also doing good work in helping humanitarian aid in North Korea. Outside the OHCHR, what are some other UN agencies that are engaging North Korea to improve different areas of human rights for people?
The agencies that are working in North Korea right now are the ones working on humanitarian assistance. Mm-hmm. And one of the things they have with the North Korean government is a strategic framework, which is a 4-year plan for where they're going to focus on their humanitarian assistance. Within that framework, because all UN agencies also do work, because human rights is a cross-cutting issue within the United Nations, of course, the way they deliver their assistance is also through a human rights-based approach, which means things like you focus on the most vulnerable, you try to be transparent in your distribution of assistance, all of these things. I will say that the restrictions on freedom of association and freedom of speech, for example, makes this process quite challenging in North Korea. Having said that, they are able to do a lot of very good work.
I think we're all familiar, for example, with the World Food Programme that does work in North Korea, providing food to vulnerable sectors of the population. I think there's also the Food and Agricultural Organization. They're doing work in North Korea too.
Yes, I don't want to talk too much about what the agencies do because I don't want to talk on their behalf, so to speak. But there's UNICEF and there's World Food Programme, there's World Health Organization. So there are different organizations there.
Okay, and you mentioned that there's some coordination there through the 4-year strategic framework.
Yeah, so like in other countries, there's a resident coordinator who organizes all the UN agencies and coordinates the assistance so that it's done in a cohesive way.
Okay. Now, North Korea is not completely absent from all discussions on human rights. You mentioned that through Geneva, it's active in some areas, such as its reporting on implementation of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or also the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and is expected to take part in the upcoming Universal Periodic Review, or UPR, that you mentioned, which will take place in May this year. So how significant, how meaningful is this participation by the Dprk government?
The participation by the Dprk government in these processes is very significant, and it's very important. It means that the Dprk writes the reports, it looks at these issues, it takes them seriously, it sends a signal to the international community that these are areas where it seeks improvement. And in that way, it's very significant, and it participates like other member states of the United Nations participates. What's also important, of course, is implementation of the recommendations that come out of these reviews. And on that, again, the lack of access makes it difficult to see exactly what is happening. But we do hope that over time a process can be started where OHCHR or other relevant actors can work with the North Korean government to try to improve in some of those areas or follow up on the recommendations that are made.
Could you tell a little bit more detail about the Universal Periodic Review? What is that and how does it work? And does North Korea find it intrusive?
So the Universal Periodic Review is a peer review where every 4 years, every 4.5 years, every member state of the United Nations comes in front of a group of peers and presents a report on the overall human rights situation in the country, what it's achieved in the past 4 years, and areas of improvement as well. The recommendations that are made by other states, of member states. And
is it all the states or is it a selected group of states?
It can be any state. So those states make recommendations to the state that's under review. North Korea has in the past accepted a number of recommendations made by other states. It went through its last review in 2014. So this year it will be reporting on how it implemented the recommendations it accepted in that year. And some of them have indeed been implemented. Things like ratification of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and a subsequent visit by a special rapporteur on disabilities. So So North Korea has engaged actively in that review. It's also made recommendations to other countries in some reviews.
That's interesting. Are you able to tell us any of the specific examples of recommendations that North Korea made to other countries?
I can't remember off the top of my head,
okay.
but it's engaged in the process, and that's important. What we would hope come out of this review also would be looking at areas where North Korea would be open to working with OHCHR or with other actors, but with OHCHR on its areas of expertise to improve human rights inside North Korea. And that can be in areas like training for officials on human rights or technical cooperation on standards for prisoners, for example, or working with some of the UN agencies in North Korea on the right to food or whatever the areas of specialization are.
How can the OHCHR practically provide technical assistance to implement those recommendations that North Korea has accepted?
There can be many different ways, of course. I mean, it can be done through training. It can be done through workshops.
These are things that you offer, or not you specifically, but your agency offers.
Sure. It's something we would offer. And then depending on what the topic would be, we would make sure we had the right people and experts in, often a combination of people who are training experts and who are technical experts and people who may understand the country or the context as well. So you would probably have a team of people working together on providing the best training possible. We sometimes do have regional trainings on human rights that are run, for example, through a regional office in Bangkok or elsewhere. And North Korea's participation in those could be another venue for this kind of technical cooperation.
Now let's talk about about accountability. It's almost exactly 5 years to the day since the report of the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea came out, which is 7th of February 2014. So that'll be, next Thursday will be exactly 5 years. This was the biggest single report on human rights abuses or alleged human rights abuses in North Korea that has ever come out. The Committee of Inquiry, or COI, found that on the balance of probability, crimes against humanity have been and were being committed in the Dprk. How has North Korea responded to that report, and how has the OHCHR followed up on these findings?
I think it's widely understood that North Korea did not accept the findings of that report. And one of the recommendations that came out of that report was indeed to establish an office to look into the violations further. And that is the office in Seoul that I'm heading right now. So that's one of the responses. We've also, since that time, had a group of experts look at avenues for international and national accountability. We've had a special rapporteur continue to work on similar issues. And the work of our office has included substantive work on accountability. And in March this year, we will be presenting a report at the Human Rights Council on avenues for accountability for North Korea that we've been, based on the work we've been doing, especially over the last 2 years.
Will that be like a kind of a follow-up or an addendum to the Committee of Inquiry's report?
In some sense, yes. In some sense, no. In the sense, yes, that we have, it will explain what steps we've taken to follow up on the report and what steps we are taking to investigate or monitor or start to look into crimes against humanity, including through creation of a repository that we were asked to set up by the Human Rights Council 2 years ago. So it will explain those steps. It will not be a substance-heavy report like the Commission of Inquiry report.
The repository you just mentioned, is that effectively a kind of a database of information and first-hand accounts?
Yes, it is, and it has data that we've collected over the past, since 2015 in the office, but also information collected by civil society organizations and others. So,
like NKDB that I just mentioned earlier, yeah.
Exactly. So the idea is to have everything, or as much as possible, in one place, so that any future accountability mechanism would be able to access the information. To have it all and to have the documentation done right now is important, because as we know, memory fades, witness testimonies get less reliable over time, and going back and trying to find the right people can also be tricky. So it's just a starting point for that process, really.
In the 5 years since the report has come out, what has gone right in terms of the international community's response or follow-up?
I think what's gone right is that the issue of crimes against humanity is now firmly on the international community's agenda. It's recognized. There have been General Assembly resolutions. There have been Human Rights Council resolutions. We are continuing the work. We are collecting evidence. We are continuing to find other ways of trying to establish crimes against humanity, or looking how these things could be addressed. So that's something I think we've done well, and OHCHR has taken the lead and continued to follow up on this in a quite consistent and consolidated way. That's
great. What's gone wrong, if anything, in the last 5 years? I mean, has the report been forgotten? I mean, 5 years is already a long time, and it's a big report. It's a lot to read, and people move on to other issues.
Of course, I mean, there are many places in the world today that require a lot of attention. I don't think the report has been forgotten. I think as far as UN reports go, it's probably one of the more interesting and readable ones. Also for a non-human rights audience, it has a very compelling narrative to it. I think what's gone wrong is that, people who were in political prison camps 5 years ago are probably still in political prison camps if they've survived. And so I don't think there is any, while we can talk at a structural level about our successes, there can't be no success until we've improved the lives of those people who are victims of crimes against humanity or human rights violations. And in that sense, we are far from the end of the project. So I think keeping that in mind, what's gone wrong is that, of course, the international system that exists is somehow inadequate in helping those people in the immediate and comprehensive way that they, as individuals with full value, fully deserve. And that's deeply tragic, of course.
Yeah, you mentioned that most people who were in prison camps, if they've survived, they still are. Is there any way that we can say that there has been a significant improvement in any aspect of human rights in North Korea in the last 5 years?
I do think that there are improvements in some areas. I think there are improvements in the understanding of rights of women and persons with disabilities, perhaps the rights of children as well. Again, it's hard to monitor everything. But I do think these steps towards engaging, the reporting to treaty bodies, the engagement with the Universal Periodic Reviews, they shouldn't be underestimated. On a structural level, not much has changed. When we talk to people who've come from North Korea recently, the things they tell us about their experience in detention, if they've been in detention, or in prisons, if they've been in prisons, or the fear of being taken to a political prison camp, are still there. And so in that sense, in terms of, in those areas, probably there's limited change.
So you've talked to North Korean refugees or defectors or escapees who live in South Korea. What's the biggest thing you've learned, or the most surprising thing you've learned from them since you've been here?
Well, I think one thing I've learned is that there's still a lot to learn. Every time I speak to someone from North Korea, I feel like I learn something I didn't know before. And even though many of the people we speak to have in some ways parallel stories of trying to leave and their lives in North Korea. Everyone has also a very individual story and very individual experiences, as one would expect in any country. It's something we must never forget when we talk about North Korea, because sometimes narratives can get watered down to a very sort of uniform picture of complete depletion. And when you speak to individuals, that's not at all the picture they convey one-on-one. So I think that's something I appreciate, that there is a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot more to understand about North Korea.
Is there a danger sorry to interrupt, is there a danger in accounts, some accounts being either exaggerated or people borrowing elements of other people's accounts? It's hard to cross-reference or cross-check these things. Is there a difficulty in that?
There is, but we try to use a methodology, and that includes interviewing people as soon as possible, for example, after they've arrived, to limit this danger. Of course, that's always a possibility, but I also think one has to be careful with dismissing accounts that people give to one very bravely and courageously, I would say. We walk in as foreigners or sometimes Koreans working in our office and ask people to tell us about the worst thing that ever happened to them, essentially. And I think it requires real courage to tell those narratives and to give us that trust. So to then go back and say, no, this may not have been true. Of course, we have to verify at a certain point, but at face value, I think we also have to respect that as a great, gift of trust that the people we interview give to us.
You mentioned that your office is exclusively looking at human rights in North Korea. North Korea has, at various times over the years, maybe not so much recently, but they used to write reports and publish books about human rights abuses in South Korea. Have you seen any of these? And does North Korea ever say, well, why are you just looking at us? Let's look at South Korea too.
No country, of course, is without its human rights problems. And not every country has crimes against humanity happening in it, of course. So there is a difference in degree and in scale. And that's important to recognize. But where things are problematic in South Korea, we have other parts of the OHCHR who will raise those areas. And the ROK also goes through its universal periodic review every 4 years, and other countries can give recommendations at that time. The ROK also has a national framework to deal with human rights issues, like the National Human Rights Commission. So yes, there is coverage of that, just not from our office in Seoul.
What about some North Korean escapees who live in South Korea? They say that they have been subject to human rights abuses here in the ROK. Is that something that they come and talk to you about?
They do occasionally, and where we do, we usually forward it to our officers who do work on the ROK in Geneva. But it's not something we particularly are qualified to look into from our office or mandated to.
Now, just last month, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So he visited Seoul. He met with the ROK government officials, as well as he met with you too, I think, didn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. How closely do you work together on Dprk issues? And is the Special Rapporteur part of the OHCHR, or is it sort of separate but parallel? How does that work?
It's parallel, I would say. He has a mandate from the High Commissioner, but he works independently, and he's an independent expert who's not paid by the OHCHR, which gives him an opportunity to lend a voice that's an expert voice that's free of any kind of influence. And he's been using that voice, as you know, over the last years when he's been in his position. We do work together, of course, and we coordinate, and we meet many of the same people. So, of course, there is close cooperation, but we write separate reports, and he has a distinct role and voice that he uses when he does his reports and his press conferences.
How do you divide up? You mentioned that he meets some of the same people. Although he's independent and separate, there must be some, I guess, some overlap there. How do you divide up the tasks and responsibilities? What does he do that you do not, or vice versa?
We do each our separate research, and we base our reports on separate areas of information. He may choose to look into certain areas that our office has not focused on.
Right.
So he takes the lead in deciding what those areas are, if he becomes particularly interested in certain areas or in certain outcomes. So he's talked in the past about the sanctions or other topics that we've not looked into so closely. But having said that, of course, we do talk to each other about what we think about things.
Right, because you're working on the same thing. So that some degree of liaison would be natural, I imagine. Now, how much longer will you be here at the OHCHR in office in Seoul? Do you is there a deadline or an expiry date?
Well, I've been here for 3.5 years now, and there is no expiry date. So I don't have any concrete plans for leaving. One of the good things about working with the UN is, of course, you get to move around to different places and you get to see different contexts. Yeah. And so it's been a good time to spend here. And every year I feel like you understand a little bit more and then you realize how much you don't understand still. So that's been a great experience so far. But no, there's no set time.
What more would you like to achieve during the rest of your term here?
I would like to see the accountability work move forward. And at the same time, I would hope that what we started with, that we can use human rights in a way to promote both the ongoing international process and connections in a positive and empowering way that helps people in North Korea. Also help that process of North Korea stepping into the folds of the international community and legitimacy, and that would include more openness to international and national human rights activists, monitors, officials, to be able to visit and document and address problems with the government. It can take decades. And of course, another thing I would, in the long term, I think anyone looking at North Korea from a human rights angle would like to do is to also be able to visit.
Is there anything that you specifically hope will come out of the second Trump-Kim summit at the end of this month?
Well, I think it's clear as a human rights person, official, that I would hope for human rights to be raised. I would hope that it would be raised in a constructive way, in a way that helps North Korea move forward on this path towards, one, denuclearization, but also legitimacy as an international actor. So one would hope that things such as access could be raised as part of those talks, Yeah,
you mentioned raising human rights in a constructive way. And earlier we talked about that there's a risk of using human rights as a tool. Some talk about the weaponization of human rights discourse or the politicization of human rights discourse, just to use it as something, a bludgeon to hit North Korea over the head with. Can you talk a little bit about that risk, that danger? Where does that come from?
If you only raise human rights when relations are not good between countries, then it becomes more of a bludgeon. If you raise human rights when relations are good and when they're not so good, as a constant, as a principle, as something that we don't veer from regardless, then we have a chance of making genuine and sustainable progress in the human rights situation, which will help with all of those other nice things that I think North Korea would see as a positive, that were spoken about in the New Year's speech. Economic development, improvement of conditions of the people, perhaps also denuclearization at some point. All of those things are also linked to respect for these human rights.
No, that makes sense. And I wish you all the best with that. And thank you very much for coming on the NK News podcast today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks once again to Signe Poulsen for coming on the NK News podcast. Don't forget, listeners, you can listen to all of our shows and read full bios and show notes on our website, nknews.org. NK News is, of course, the leading repository on North Korean news, research and analysis, and we hope to see you there. And you can send feedback, comments, questions, or guest suggestions to podcast@nknews.org. Our podcast was produced by Arias Dare and facilitated by Chad O'Carroll and Christina Lee, who has the flu this week, and we hope she gets gets better very soon. Lastly, a reminder that one random reviewer per week will win a free NK News membership. So please review us after listening and you might win. And you can save $50 off your NK News subscription by using the code podcast at checkout. Please continue to listen and share this with your friends. Thanks very much and check us again next time.